Good afternoon. My name is Nir Zakovich, and I am the director of the Applied Ethics Center at UMass in Boston. And good morning in the future to Professor Tim Bayne in Australia. Tim is a philosopher of mind and cognitive science who works on the nature of consciousness at Monash University in Melbourne. Before that, he taught at Macquarie, at the University of Western Ontario, the University of Manchester, and at Oxford. He wrote The Unity of Consciousness in 2010. He also wrote Thought, a Very Short Introduction in 2013. He's the editor of Delusion and Self-Deception, 2008, the Oxford Companion to Consciousness, 2009, and Cognitive Phenomenology, 2011. Tim and I met at a Templeton retreat in New York City this summer, where we were taught, in my case, without much effect, to write longhand journalism. But we became very good friends and had a really nice time talking to each other for a few days. And I told Tim about our project on AI and the ethics of emerging technologies and the impact of AI on everyday experience. And he was kind enough to agree to give a talk for us. The talk is Organoids, Androids, and the Consciousness Club. Tim, wonderful to have you, and take it away.
Thanks, yeah, thanks for the lovely introduction. And yeah, it was a real pleasure to hang out in New York and to get to know you. And it's really nice to be speaking to you today from the future. So this talk was originally written as a keynote for the last ASSC meeting, which is the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, with 500 people in the audience. And as a keynote, it's got some goofy graphics, and it was written for people without really any ethics or multi-layered philosophy background at all. I've modified it for you today because I know that you have a very different background, but it's probably still got a few traces of being written as a keynote. Still got a few goofy graphics, I'm afraid. Okay, so at the moment, there's really only one way to bring conscious agents into existence. It's a way that's familiar to anyone who spent time on a farm or taken a sex education class. But it's likely that in the near future, certainly within the lifetime, I think, of people in this virtual room, we're going to have new ways of bringing conscious agents into existence. So these are cerebral organoids, brain organoids, neural organoids. I think the limit at the moment is for organoids is about 2 million neurons, which is about double the number of neurons in a bee brain. A mouse brain has about 10 million. So they're complex, and some fascinating research which is proceeding breakneck speed here. One of the most eye-catching developments, this paper came out of Mercury's lab in San Diego a while back, showing brain waves that are sort of reminiscent of what you might see in a preterm fetus in a cortical organoid. And in a paper I wrote with a couple of neuroscientists a year or two ago, we speculated that future developments of organoids might harbor islands of awareness, and we talked a little bit about how islands of awareness might be identified. I suspect if and when organoids do become conscious, it's going to be in the context of what's called an assembloid, where you've got an organoid hooked up with some kind of robot. This again is Mercury's lab in San Diego, exploring the organoid environment. In fact, the environment of the organoid, in effect, you're giving it a body of a kind. Another path to synthetic consciousness is, of course, AI. We've got AI systems that can beat us in general knowledge and in constrained games, shogi or chess. And so all these developments raise a bunch of questions. will we be able to reliably distinguish conscious artifacts, things that are genuinely conscious, from things that simply seem to be conscious or strike those who engage with them as conscious? Is there going to be general agreement on the part of society or on the part of experts as to which artifacts are conscious and which are merely pseudo-conscious, which merely appear to be conscious? Is the creation of conscious artifacts going to be guided by some kind of theory so that we know what we're doing and we're going to be aware that the things that we've created are conscious? Or, as it were, is it going to be something that emerges by accident? So in retrospect, we might say, oh, that thing is conscious, that thing that we created 6 months ago is conscious. But its initial creation might not have been guided by an intention to create a conscious artifact. I think these are all pressing questions. They're in the background of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm not going to address them head on. Or I'll come back to some of them briefly at the end. The thing I want to put on the table today is this question. I'm going to call it the creation question. Should we attempt to create conscious artifacts? And sort of one way to rephrase that: should we attempt to bring new members into the consciousness club? Should we attempt to augment the membership of those entities that we take to be conscious? Now, I think some people are inclined not to take this question seriously, perhaps on the grounds that they don't think that we're yet in a position to create synthetic consciousness. But I think that's the wrong response for a couple of reasons. One is, I think it's a really hard question. It's really, really difficult. It cuts to deep, unsolved issues in ethics, in metaphysics, and epistemology. I'm certainly not going to attempt to solve it today. So I think, the sooner we get it on the table and subject it to some serious discussion, the better. Another reason to take it seriously, as it were, for academics and philosophers to take it seriously, is everybody else is interested in this question, and we've got the tools to at least frame and articulate the question more carefully than anyone else has, I would argue. So here's a paper from, I don't know, I think it was Nature, looking at organoids from a couple of years back. And of course, the question that this science journalist is raising is, could organoids be conscious? Would we know if they were conscious, and what should we do about it? And it's just clear in this article and the discussion surrounding it that that would have ethical implications, political implications. Here's a preprint of a paper actually coming out of a Melbourne lab using the word sentience in the title in connection with what they call brain dish, which is a system that integrates neurons and chips. So it's a kind of assembloid in a way. Now, I've talked to the authors. Some of them are colleagues. They don't mean by sentience what philosophers mean by sentience, what I mean by sentience. I think this is an inappropriate use of the term sentience. But the fact is, we now have leading scientists using the word sentience in publications in connection with organoids, more organoid-like entities. Just going to raise the stakes of the debate. And of course, in connection with AI systems, we've had the recent kerfuffle about ChatGPT being sentient. That kind of issue is just going to keep kicking on, it seems to me. So we need to take the creation question seriously. I don't think it can be shelved as some kind of frivolous inquiry. One of the few people, at least in my world, in sort of from the consciousness science end of things, to have done so is Thomas Metziger. Here's his take on what we should do. Until 2050, there should be a global moratorium on synthetic phenomenology, strictly banning all research that directly aims or knowingly risks the emergence of artificial consciousness in postbiotic carrier systems. So that's one position that's out there. We don't know enough about consciousness. We don't know enough about how to identify it in artificial systems, and there should be a strict moratorium. Metziger says until we're in a better position to understand it. I think that's a position that should be taken seriously. I think it's problematic. I don't think it should be automatically embraced. But that's, as it were, one point of around which one might navigate a discussion here. I should say, though, I don't think there's any reason to think that Metziger's moratorium is going to be followed. I don't see any reason to think that anyone's actually taking it seriously, although he himself is quite influential in some of the European initiatives here. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to review some of the arguments against the creation of conscious artifacts, synthetic consciousness. I'm going to develop 3 arguments for creating conscious artifacts. And then I'm going to kind of take a step back and drill down into kind of fundamental issue that I think is in the background of a lot of these discussions. And one of the upshots, and I should say this talk doesn't aim to really come down hard in any particular place. It's trying to get the lay of the land more than anything. But one of the upshots is I think the ethical issues interact in interesting and problematic ways with issues about the nature of consciousness. Okay, a bit of stage setting. Again, this is sort of issues that are perhaps obvious for ethicists and philosophers of ethics, but sometimes the obvious is worth restating. The question of synthetic consciousness is often put in deontic terms, and I myself have sort of set things up. Should we create artificial consciousness, synthetic consciousness? But that's not the only way to put it, and that's actually not the framework that I prefer. I prefer a more axiological framework. I prefer to approach it in terms of what's valuable, what's worthwhile. So would it be a worthwhile activity? Would it be valuable? What kind of ends might be promoted? What states of affairs do we have reasons to promote? Which isn't to say I think deontic questions are irrelevant. I don't want to dismiss them. Questions about what's permissible are certainly relevant here, but I don't think that's the only lens through which we should view the question of synthetic consciousness for reasons I think will become clearer as we go. So deontic considerations, deontic approaches versus an axiological approach. The other point, which again I think is sort of potentially obvious, but worth stating, is we shouldn't be looking for, certainly shouldn't expect to find individually decisive reasons that might apply across the board. Ethics is a messy business. I think it's useful to look for general considerations, and there's a place for given kind of first philosophy, which is in some sense what I'm trying to do here. But I want to point out, I want to recognize that applying general considerations, moving from first philosophy to public policy is going to be messy. There's all sorts of competing considerations, all sorts of things that might need to be balanced, multiple factors that need to be considered. And so there's a place for first philosophy, and there's a place for trying to work out how to translate first philosophy into real world policy. I'm not going to do much of that today, but that's a thing. Okay, here's an argument against the creation of conscious artifacts. And I think this kind of argument is what drives Metziger, and it's an argument that you hear from pretty much any scientist. This is the first out of the starting gate kind of argument that you get. Something like this, an argument from suffering. We've got reason to avoid adding to the amount of suffering in the world. Creating conscious artifacts would add to the amount of suffering in the world. We should avoid creating conscious artifacts. And pretty much all of the public commentary, even from bioethicists, I think, on organoids, sort of starts here. It's an intuitive argument. It resonates, I think, with the public. The problem with it is it's you can run a parallel argument for the creation of human beings. So here's an antinatalist argument. We have reason to avoid adding to the amount of suffering in the world. Creating human beings adds to the amount of suffering in the world. We should avoid creating human beings. Now, there are some people who think that that's a good argument, and antinatalists. It's a view. So according to a strong kind of antinatalism, holds that procreation is always wrong because coming into existence is always a serious harm. And that's a serious view. It's been defended by serious people. Here's David Beneto's wonderful little book, quite influential. And as we discovered in New York, near written up, lovely write-up of Beneteau in the New Yorker at one point. It's also a funny book. The introduction says, "To my parents," even though they brought me into existence. There's some interesting lines in it. I'm not going to engage in any serious way with antinatalism here. I want to recognize, to acknowledge that it's a thing. I just want to make one point, autobiographical as much as anything. This is why I'm not an anti-natalist, or one of the main problems I have with antinatalism. The main line of argument that you get, at least in Beneto's version of antinatalism, goes something like this. Just move my screen so I can. Yeah. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. But the absence of pleasure is not bad, unless there's somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. So Beneteau takes this to be a fairly driving, fairly robust intuition. There's an asymmetry between the absence of pain and the absence of pleasure. And pain and pleasure, he's not committed to anything kind of hedonism here. I think it's just, these are placeholders for normative, valuable states of affairs. And from there, he goes on to generate antinatalism. And he says, why should we embrace the asymmetry? Well, it explains our intuitions. It's wrong to create a miserable person. It's wrong to create someone that we know will be miserable, but not wrong to intentionally avoid creating a happy person. And I agree that there is a very strong intuition here. There is a kind of asymmetry. It's a puzzling one, and it needs to be accounted for. But if you're going to drive everything, if you're going to drive your procreative ethics on intuitions, then here's another intuition you've got to take seriously. Procreation is not ordinarily wrong. That's a fairly robust intuition that the vast majority of people have. And Beneto's antinatalism flies in the face of it. So it seems to me cherry picking to take the intuitions that drive the asymmetry seriously, but not other kinds of procreative intuitions seriously. So I think there's something methodologically deeply problematic with Beneto's position. I won't say any more here. If you're interested, I wrote a paper a decade ago on this. Beneteau replied to me and 10 other critics in this paper. He's not impressed. I'm not impressed with his response. So there we have it. It seems to me that there is a corner of procreative ethics which is antinatalist in stripe, but for the most of us, and this includes a significant number of people working in the ethics of procreation, hold that the creation of human beings is generally a worthwhile activity, one that's reasonable to pursue and promote. I think that's a position that most of us would start from. Of course, we recognize there are conditions in which human beings should not be intentionally brought into existence. We recognize, most of us, that there's a non-empty category of miserable life cases. It's very interesting to try and work out what the structure, what the dimensions of that category are, but I think most of us are happy to grant that there is such a thing as a miserable life case. And that gives rise, I think, to a better argument from suffering, and maybe it's the argument that people like Metzinger have in mind all along. There's a significant risk that conscious artifacts would have miserable lives, right? Lives from their point of view not worth living. If there's a significant risk that a possible agent would have a miserable life, we should avoid creating it. We should avoid creating conscious artifacts. I think this is a good argument, i.e., not obviously universally demonstrative, but something that needs to be taken seriously, a point around which any account of the ethics of synthetic consciousness ought to navigate. The load-bearing premise here, or the controversial premise, I think, is the first premise. Why might you think there's a significant risk that conscious artifacts will have miserable lives? Well, there's at least 3 reasons, it seems to me. One is a kind of socially structured reason. You might think that synthetic consciousness wouldn't be treated with appropriate respect. And here we need to ask about folk attitudes, folk descriptions of consciousness. So, you know, it may be that the folk simply deny that the creature in question, the entity in question, would be conscious. There are questions about opacity and our access to the inner lives of synthetically conscious systems. Maybe it just be incredibly difficult to tell whether, from the point of view of the agent, its life is meaningful to it. And there's questions about our capacity to make conscious artifacts according to, as it were, the design specifications that we would want. So we might just be really, really bad at knowing how to structure things. I think it's very difficult to evaluate these points in the abstract. I think one needs to have a worked model. One needs to apply it to a particular type of organoid or assembloid or a particular type of AI system to know how likely these issues are to be pressing. But it seems to me that it is at least, you know, epistemically possible that these risks can be reasonably mitigated in at least some cases. And I'm going to at least proceed on the assumption that they can. I'm sort of going to move to a more foundational question, like suppose that the risk of the system having a miserable life could be reasonably mitigated. What attitude should we then take to its creation? Well, one place to start is with the creation of ordinary non-synthetic agents. So here's my son, Otto, photo taken a couple of years ago. Most of us regard the existence or the creation of human beings, conscious agents that are human, as a source of value. But there are two ways, well, there are multiple ways, but two generic ways to think about the value of consciousness and why it might be that consciousness is a source of value. There's a sort of an instrumental take on this, and there's an intrinsic or inherent take on this. I think it's very plausible to think of consciousness as instrumentally valuable. Why is that? Well, because you might think that consciousness is necessary for, not just in a sort of causal sense, but perhaps even constitutively bound up with a bunch of things that we think are valuable. You might think that without consciousness, an agent can't be genuinely creative, can't be genuinely rational, or they can't exhibit autonomous agency. And you might think that each of those things, creativity, rationality, autonomous agency, is itself inherently intrinsically valuable. So insofar as you want to create a world with creativity, or certain types of creativity, or certain types of rationality or agency, you might think we want to create a world with conscious agents. That line of defense is, I think, really plausible, but it's problematic, or at least it raises controversial issues, because you need to build a bridge between consciousness and whatever the candidate phenomena in question is. So, for example, it's just not obvious. There's no settled view as to how consciousness and rationality, for example, are related. With that in mind, I want to sort of focus more on the intrinsic or inherent value of consciousness. And I want to sort of press on this idea that the existence of conscious agents, and perhaps also certain types of conscious states, is an intrinsic or inherent value. It's a good in and of itself. I think that's not a crazy thought. It's one that's can be found in lots of ethical theories and lots of ethical writing. And I want to think through a little bit how that might, in various guises, motivate a case for the creation of synthetic consciousness. You could tell the story or run a lot of the arguments I'm interested in focusing on conscious states, experiences. I'm going to focus on conscious agents, a slightly different framework, just because it keeps things a bit simpler, I think. So here's the first of three arguments that I just want to throw out there for consideration. I've got various levels of commitment to them. Here's the first, an argument from the inherent value of consciousness. Conscious agents are inherently valuable. We've got reason to create inherently valuable entities. We've got reason to create conscious artifacts, synthetically conscious agents. I think, too, to my mind, the second premise is almost tautological. What it is for something to be a value or to be valuable is that you've got a kind of reason, maybe a weak reason, easily defeated, but a pro tanto reason nonetheless. More controversial, I think, is the first premise, and I don't have an argument for it, but here's a sort of a corny kind of intuition pump, if you like. I mean, suppose you're in the business of creating worlds. You're a kind of god, and you can create alpha or beta. Alpha's got one conscious agent, conscious monkey, and beta's got a bunch more. Now, I don't think there's any obligation to create beta or alpha. I don't think we have to maximize the number of conscious agents. If you're a world creator and you say, no, I'm going to go with alpha rather than beta, I don't think you'd be doing anything wrong. So this is why I distinguish deontic rather as opposed to axiological approaches here. But I think there's at least an intuition that I don't think I'm alone in having, that there's something a bit better about beta. There's more, as it were, subjects of experience. There's more experiential agents, and that itself is a good making feature of beta over alpha. So you've got some reason to create beta over alpha. Now, there's all sorts of directions in which this line of thought leads, and I'm at the end of the day, this may be a line of thought one wants to reject, but at least I think there's at least a prima facie line of argument here, it seems to me. So that's the argument from inherent value. Here's a second argument that might lend support for the creation of synthetic consciousness. Call it the resilience argument. Here's just some platitudes by way of background to the argument. So I take it to be fairly obvious, it's not controversial, that we're vulnerable to a diverse array of existential threats. Anyone who's lived through the last couple of years can understand that thought. Some of these threats, I think, would clearly eradicate conscious artifacts. So a certain kind of meteorite strike would take us out and take any conscious artifacts out as well. But at least other kind of threats might leave certain types of conscious artifacts unscathed, would leave them, well, certainly not imperil their existence, not the existential threats. So here's alpha, which just has us and various other ordinary forms of consciousness in it. We can imagine a kind of virus takes us all out. But if we had created various kinds of conscious artifacts and the virus came along, we'd be taken out. But you would still have the existence of conscious agents in the universe. The universe would not be devoid of consciousness. And you might think, it's not a crazy thought, it seems to me, that that's a good thing. So here's the argument: the existence of conscious artifacts would increase the likelihood that there are conscious agents in the distant future. We've got reason to try and ensure that there are conscious agents in the distant future, so we've got reason to create conscious artifacts. Again, not a demonstrative, not a decisive consideration here, but at least a consideration in favor of the creation of conscious artifacts. Seems to me two is not very, it seems to me that the controversial premise here is the second one, right? Do we actually have any kind of reason, would a distant future, a very distant future in which there are conscious agents be better than a very, very distant future in which there aren't any conscious agents? Again, I don't have as it were, an argument for that. But if we're just at the level of pumping intuitions and trying to get clear on what seems to be an intuitive starting point for discussion, it seems to me I've got some inclination to endorse. Here's a third argument, the phenomenal diversity argument. Again, a bit of stage setting is required. So consider something I'm going to call phenomenal space. So phenomenal space is a massively multidimensional space into which one can slot any type of conscious agent. And your position in phenomenal space, as it were, the tile of phenomenal space, the location in phenomenal space that you tile, captures what it's like to be you, captures the kind of experiences you have, the kind of conscious agency you enjoy. So here's phenomenal space, as it were. Here's neurotypical human beings. I mean, it's not going to be a point space, it's going to be a region, but there's no that complication. Here's where your neurotypical dog, here's your octopus, and here's some kind of conscious insect, a conscious bee, for example. So there's a question, where in phenomenal space might conscious artifacts fall? And I take it, in principle, they could really fall anywhere. Some conscious artifacts might be, as it were, relatively close neighbors of us in phenomenal space. So you can imagine a kind of conscious humanoid that has, as it were, a synthetic brain whose functional architecture is very similar to ours, has a body, is embodied in along the lines of a neurotypical human being, might have slightly different experiences, but given the functional architecture, given the details of embodiment, what it's like to be that AI system might be very similar, or that android might be very similar to us. But others will be quite different. And we can imagine some, sorry, go back here. We can imagine some AI systems that tile regions of phenomenal space that are really very different from anything that is currently tiled. Presumably that would be true of a conscious organoid that isn't robustly embodied. So how might that generate an argument for synthetic consciousness? Well, creating conscious artifacts would augment the amount of phenomenal diversity in the world. And depending on the kind of conscious artifacts we create, it could radically augment the amount of phenomenal diversity in the world. Second premise, phenomenal diversity is a good-making feature of reality. We've got reason to create conscious artifacts. Now, I think it's clear that controversial premise here is going to be the second one. Is phenomenal diversity in any sense a good-making feature? Is it something that ought to be valued? Well, here's one sort of intuition to think that, as a matter of fact, many of us do value at least some form of phenomenal diversity. Again, go back to our two possible worlds that you can create as a world creator. So alpha has a bunch of conscious monkeys on it. Beta has the same number of conscious individuals, but is more phenomenally diverse. A greater percentage of phenomenal space is tiled. There's different types of experiences. And I take it one of the reasons that you might mourn species loss, and there's a bunch of reasons why you might think species loss is a bad thing, but one of the reasons you might mourn species loss is that it involves a reduction of phenomenal diversity. The world is less rich, fewer, as it were, locations in phenomenal space are tiled as a result of, say, octopuses becoming extinct. So again, by no means a knockdown defense of premise 2 of the phenomenal diversity argument, but a consideration in favor of taking the argument seriously. So here are 3 arguments for creating conscious artifacts. And I think each of them has at least some prima facie force. Now, at this point, there's 2 kinds of responses you might make to those arguments. Response 1 would be, the first response would be say, look, okay, there's some arguments for creating conscious artifacts. And for thinking it's at least a reasonable, valuable thing to do. Maybe we've got no obligation to do it, but there's some values that would be promoted by the creation of conscious artifacts. But those arguments need to be balanced against the arguments against creating conscious artifacts. Right? Worries about suffering, worries about miserable lives, maybe worries about threats to our own survival. Right? So we're in the messy business of balancing arguments for and against arguments against, and we'd have to look at the details of any potential conscious artifact we might create. We could play that game, but it's very difficult to play response 1 game in the abstract. So I'm not going to go down that road here. I'm going to focus on the second response, which is the second kind of worry, which is that someone might say, look, the discussion thus far presupposes that consciousness is normatively significant. That consciousness has a kind of value in its own right, and that presupposition is problematic. So this response tackles head on, as it were, the thought that there's a kind of intrinsic value to conscious agents or to certain types of conscious states. Okay. So let's use the term sentientism in the way that some people have been using it lately in the literature, to refer to the view that conscious agents have a positive value that non-conscious agents like. That non-conscious agents lack. That consciousness brings with it a kind of fundamental, weighty normative significance. What I want to suggest now, and this is where we go a little bit into theories of consciousness, is that there's an interesting kind of tension between sentientism and approaches, influential approaches to consciousness. And that tension has to be resolved in order for anything I said in the first half of the talk to have a lot of, to make a lot of sense, really, to have any force. Here's one way to put that tension. I'm going to call it the normative insignificance argument. And here, this is not particularly original, although maybe my way of setting things up is original, but I'm drawing on a bunch of things that people have said in the recent literature. So I don't want to take credit for identifying this issue. So you assume reductionism about consciousness. Assume that consciousness is some kind of functional property or neural property or computational property, something that can be, as it were, captured in a description that doesn't use the words consciousness or any of its synonyms, experience. If reductionism is true, then the contrast between conscious states or agents and unconscious states and agents will turn on physical, functional facts, so non-experiential facts that lack intrinsic significance. Now that's a controversial claim. I'm going to try and warm you up to it in a second. Take that on spec for now. Third, distinctions that have fundamental normative significance must be grounded in distinctions that have intrinsic significance. So consciousness lacks fundamental normative significance. It can't really do heavy lifting in the context of discussions about the creation of conscious artifacts. Can't do anything like the kind of heavy lifting that I was putting it to work to do. So let me say a little something about premise 3, and then I'm going to go back and move on to premise 2. So premise 3, distinctions that have fundamental normative significance must be grounded in distinctions that are intrinsically significant. If it's just put in this way, without the fundamental, if it's just put as it were, distinctions that have normative significance must be grounded in distinctions that have intrinsic significance, I think the claim is problematic. So here's an objection. Turning 18 isn't intrinsically significant, right? Take a kid who's 17 years old, minus 18 minus 1 day, they turn 18 an hour later. Now they can drink beer in certain jurisdictions, or fight for their country, or get legally married without their parents' consent, whatever it is, right? So you might think, what happens to them in that hour when they turn 18? Physically, functionally, it's insignificant. It's a trivial difference. But now they've got a normative status that they didn't an hour earlier. Okay, that's fine, I think, as far as it goes, but the norms governing drinking, or whether you can get married without your parents' consent, or whether you can fight for your country, are conventional. We've got to, for a bunch of reasons, we've got to put a line somewhere. We happen to put it when a kid turns 18. But the thought is that the intrinsic significance of consciousness isn't conventional in that way. There's not an arbitrariness around it. It's not the result of some kind of socially sanctioned stipulation. It arises from the nature of reality itself. It's a response to natural features. It's a response to distinctions that are inherent in nature itself. I think that's the intuitive thought here. So turning 18, being able to drink, it's not fundamental normative significance, but the distinction, the normative significance of consciousness is meant to be fundamentally normative. That's the thought. So the objection from turning 18, I think, is not really germane. Okay, let's assume 3 is good. What about 2? Why on earth might someone endorse 2? If reductionism is true, then the contrast between conscious agents, states, and unconscious states and agents will turn on physical functional facts that lack intrinsic significance. Here's one way to feel the force of this thought. Consider one of the most influential, arguably the most influential theories of consciousness, global workspace theory. I won't go into details here. I'm just going to use this as a word example. I think the point generalizes to any kind of reductive theory. So here's the basic idea. According to global workspace theory, consciousness involves basically activation of a workspace that can take input from any really sensory, perceptual, emotional system, make it accessible within that workspace, and distribute it to various motor systems and reasoning systems. In human beings, the workspace is meant to be implemented in the prefrontal parietal cortex, but that's, as I think of it, incidental. It's really, in some fundamental sense, a functionalist conception of consciousness involving global integration and distribution of information. Okay, so that's the global workspace picture in a nutshell. Now imagine variations on a global workspace architecture where you've got fewer input systems, less highly connected nodes within the workspace, fewer consuming systems, fewer systems that take what's in the global workspace and make it accessible. So these are obviously just toy models, but it's not inconceivable that each of these models, the top left, the top right, might differ from the global workspace as it's instantiated in human beings, in adult neurotypical human beings, in the way that a global workspace in, say, a very young infant, 3 months or 6 months, might differ, or a workspace in an organoid or some AI system. And if you're a global workspace theorist, then you've got a question. Okay, is this workspace global enough to support consciousness? It's global-ish. It's akin to the global workspace that we have in some ways, but not in others. It might have richer connection between nodes within the workspace. Might have fewer consuming systems, might have more consuming systems. So any advocate of the global workspace theory needs to say how far along various parameters, along various dimensions, a workspace can depart from, as it were, our workspace and still count as a consciousness supporting workspace. Thus far, no one's done that. Not thus far. It's really hard to see anything in the literature where anyone's tried to do that. So you might think of this sort of as a close neighbors problem. So the workspace in a 3-month-old infant or a fetus, it's going to be a kind of a neighbor of the workspace that you and I enjoy. Could that be normatively significant? Take a workspace that falls just outside the parameters that a global workspace theorist says is required for consciousness. But for one connection, it would be a global workspace, but it doesn't have that connection. Right? If consciousness is normatively significant, if sentientism is true, then that workspace is not, as it were, doesn't have the fundamental normative significance that consciousness supporting workspaces do. But from a physical, as it were, point of view, from a functional point of view, it's just one connection, right? It's got it's got slightly less integration than your, as it were, brain does or my brain does. It's hard to see how differences like that could have a fundamental normative significance. It's a bit like the difference between, being 18 and being 1 hour younger than 18, 17, 349 days or whatever it is, right? Yeah, okay. There's a normative difference there, but only because we decided. But consciousness is not meant to be stipulative like that. So there's a significance constraint on reductionist theories of consciousness coming at things from an ethical perspective, it seems to me. An adequate reductionism must explain why the contrast between consciousness and its neighbors, its close neighbors from a physical functional point of view, is normatively significant. Maybe that can be done. got some thoughts as to how you might go about trying to do that. But so far, I don't think there's anything in the literature that even really attempts to address that challenge. Okay, you might reject reductionism and say, okay, here's a fixed intuitive point. Consciousness is normally significant. Reductionism can't account for that. We've got to reject reductionism. Right? Your ethics is driving a theory of mind. Okay, I get that. That's not crazy, it seems to me. But if you're not a reductionist, well, what are you? Well, one view on the table in the literature is kind of a limitivist reductionist illusionism. Consciousness doesn't really exist. It's a kind of an illusion. Well, that's not going to help with your ethics. I don't think it can be normally significant if it doesn't exist. If you're not an eliminativist or a reductionist, you're possibly going to be a primitivist, a kind of a dualist or a panpsychist. That's a view at the moment. It's getting a lot of airtime. But that's not going to help with your ethics either, or at least it might not, because primitivism plus sentientism may require radical revision to our normative commitments. Currently, primitivists suggest with a straight face that electrons, neutrinos, quarks, the fundamental elements of the physical world might harbor a kind of proto-consciousness. There's really, once you've got primitivism in play, there's very few constraints on the kinds of creatures that might be, or kind of entities that might be conscious. So that's really going to have some pretty serious knock-on effects for your ethics. So rejecting reductionism might be problematic, but embracing primitivism is sort of out of the frying pan into the fire, it seems to me. Let me wrap things up with one kind of concluding thought. Sorry, I'm going a little bit over time here. I've been talking about issues that arise from conscious artifacts, but I think actually the real action in the next decade or two or three is going to be questions that arise from folk descriptions of consciousness. This is really, I think, what I suspect I'm going to be spending the rest of my career on. There are going to be cases in which the folk ascribe consciousness to an entity, but the academic community doesn't. So we saw this with, was it GPT-3 or ChatGPT? I forget, but this is going to be coming down the line, it seems to me. You couldn't really find a serious academic thinking that, no, it was Lambda, sorry, it was Lambda, thinking that Lambda was conscious, but at least, at least one Google engineer was taking that seriously and getting some traction. And once the robots come, which, the AI helpers, the caregivers, the nannies, or the caregivers for elderly people and for young people, the drive to ascribe consciousness to those entities from the folk is going to be very strong, I would suggest. And there are going to be cases in which the academic community is seriously considering or taking seriously the ascription of consciousness to an entity that doesn't seem to be generating any kind of folk descriptions of consciousness. And that's probably going to be the case with the organoids. Right? They're not going to give you the behavioral manifestations of consciousness, but we might have a reason to think that the internal structure supports consciousness. So that's going to complicate things. Even more, a further dimension of complication, as if things weren't complicated enough, is that the academic community is not going to speak with one voice, it seems to me, almost certainly. So here's a paper coming out of, well, as the title says, it's an academic survey on pretty much the state of consciousness science, based on attendees at the last, what was it, 2020 and 2021, I think, or 2021, 2022, meetings of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, the premier academic body in this field. I think they had about 160 people which filled out the survey. Indicate whether you think each of the following entities has consciousness, with a green definitely yes, red definitely not, and shades in the middle. Most people think they're conscious. Most people think other people are conscious. But, as you go down, we get significant differences of opinion. You know, it's pretty much split. Well, take fish. You know, it's pretty much treated. You know, the responses are distributed pretty much evenly between all those options. And I suspect there's going to be a bunch of AI systems in the next 10 or 20 years, which are going to be similarly divisive amongst academics. And this is basically consciousness scientists filling this out, a handful of philosophers. And what's really going on, I think, is this fundamental disagreement about theories of consciousness. So here are some 10 theoretical approaches using the same response codes. And again, there's very little theoretical agreement. And in my view, and I would defend this to the cows come home, the theory here, predictive processing theory, that gets the most positive responses is not really a theory of consciousness. So to the degree that we have consensus, which it's not really much consensus there at all, but the leading account by this light is sort of a theory of something else and not really a theory of consciousness. So I think the future looks fairly dim for the prospect of academic convergence. So even if, as it were, public policy, even if we are in a position where there was respect for experts and people said, okay, here's what the experts say. Experts said this system's conscious, this system's not conscious. We've got a bunch of strong intuitions, but we're going to defer to the experts. We're not in that space. There's not a lot of love for experts in the current environment. But even if we were, I don't think the experts would be speaking with one voice. So it's very unclear, it seems to me, how things are going to shake out. All right, I've gone over time, but I'll leave things there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was super interesting. I am going to open this up to questions. Why don't you, Tim, stop sharing so that
Right. Yeah.
we can see each other in the
Did
gallery.
is that good? Does that stop sharing?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool.
All right. Let's see. Does anyone want to? Yeah, we're a small group. Just go. Chris, hi.
You're still muted, Chris. At least I can't hear.
Sorry about that. I'm walking, and
Sure.
so my reception is
Okay.
not very good.
Sure.
I want to ask about something that opens up for me between the notion of consciousness and conscious agents. And I guess maybe I'm just speaking to my ethical intuitions, but I'm not really convinced that consciousness is the primary.
Chris, that froze.
Need to
you
stand
there?
still, Chris.
All right. Chris, you know what? Wait, let's try again.
I'll try again later. I'll try again later.
Okay, sounds good.
Something about agency, but okay.
Okay, we'll give that another shot in a bit. Other questions? Stephen.
Hello, thanks for that. That was great. So this is, I hate when people do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to, in a way, ask for something that wasn't there rather than.
Yeah.
So I think part of the issue of the ought question of whether we ought to do this, whether we ought to create this, is going to relate to the non-normative question of why are we in fact going to do it? I mean, insofar as we can prognosticate that, because that's going to have a big, in certain worlds, if we did it for certain kinds of reasons, then is going to be a different world than if we're actually going to do it for different reasons. And so it seems to me that we need a kind of account of that. And I'm not sure what, a lot of things could be said there. I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that issue.
Yeah. I mean, I've got thoughts. I don't know how coherent and informed they are. I mean, I guess I should say, why are we in fact going to do it? What one says here, I think, depends pretty centrally on how high the bar is for doing it, or how difficult it is to do. Right?
Yeah.
And so this is why it's very difficult to say something that's, as it were, theoretically neutral or theoretically uncommitted. So if you have a fairly minimal, if you have minimal conception of what's required for consciousness, why are we in fact going to do it? Well, you know, there are people in the center of Melbourne, this Cortical Labs, this paper that just came out where they use the word sentience in the title. They've got a theory of brain function. They want to see what they can do with that theory and integrating neural activity and chips. And in some sense it's driven by trying to test the theory, free energy minimization conception of brain function. And they're just so that's, I think it's a scientific inquiry. And there's a kind of we just want to tinker and just want to make stuff. Can we make stuff? Is it going to work? There's that kind of tinkering kind of driver, right? Another driver would be, most of the organoid work is looking at, it gives you a really nice way of looking at theories of brain functioning and trying to deal with medical conditions. You can mess with organoids. You can change what turns off and the sequencing of things in the way that you can't with real brains, right? So, and it's not a novel point, people made it before, but the closer you get to a real developing human brain, the more useful those models are going to be. But the more reason you have to think that you might be creating something that's conscious. So, you're not trying to create a conscious entity, you're trying to create something that you can model Zika virus on, or whatever it is. Oh. But, that might be one of the upshots. The other motivation, which I think sort of speaks directly to your question maybe, is, so after I gave this talk, this was a talk I gave at the most recent ASSC meeting, someone came up to me afterwards and said, look, I think it's really, really bad to suggest there should be a moratorium on this kind of work, because this is the best way we have of studying consciousness. We want to understand consciousness for a bunch of reasons. We want to be able to treat disorders of consciousness. And what better way to study consciousness than to create things that have all the preconditions for consciousness in lab environments, and you can, go to town with interventions. So now that's coming at things from an organoid point of view. Coming at things from an AI point of view, well, what are the drivers for ChatGPT or Lambda? The multiple drivers, and most of them involve money or defense. So yeah, look, I think it's a great question, and it problematizes any attempt to come up with any kind of framework for thinking about these things, because there's so many ways into it.
Chris, you want to try again?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. I was on the move. I really like this talk. I thought it was really fascinating. I was especially interested by the three different arguments, the diversity argument, for instance. But I guess my question was, why consciousness? Why is consciousness the normative, the significant property, as opposed to something like responsible agency, competent agency, agency that can respond to the space of reason, something like that? I mean, just to use one of the nice examples, it's probably true that octopuses have tremendous consciousness, and they would be, in the diversity argument. But I haven't seen a lot of evidence that we have responsible agency from octopuses. And so I guess I would want to, I got a little stuck between the gap between consciousness as such and conscious agents, because I was just focusing on the agent part. And it seems to me that's, since the normative space of reasons is a game of, citing and keeping people to, or keeping agents to norms, strikes me that it's the responsible agency that's the primary normative significance rather than the consciousness. And I'm curious about how you think about that. And I don't obviously want your whole story about consciousness, but convince me a little bit that I need to focus on consciousness as opposed to something more traditional like normative agency or responsible agency.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris. So the easy bit is it's octopuses, apparently. And octopus people apparently get quite upset when you say octopi, which is what most of us do. It's something to do with Greek and Latin. I think octopuses is Greek. Anyway, look, it's a great question. Here's an easy response, and there's a short response, and there's a long response, which maybe we can talk about if we've got time. I don't want to say that consciousness is the prime normative feature here. So I would want to take very seriously everything you said about reasons responsive agency being normatively significant, and maybe in many, many contexts here, more normatively significant than consciousness. But I guess why consciousness? Well, in part because I come at things from the consciousness world. And so I guess I'm trying to think through, well, what happens if you give some normative significance to consciousness? I mean, I take this, a bunch of things can be normatively significant in their own right? And so, I mean, here, one little addition to that, the thing I'm working on right now with a bunch of people is evidence for consciousness in very early infancy and in the fetus. Now, I take it no one really thinks a very young infant has reasons responsive agency. That's just not on the cards. You don't get much in the way of any kind of agency in the womb. But there is a thought that if there's consciousness of some kind in the fetus, then that changes the normative situation somehow. How it changes, okay, that's up for grabs. And it's that thought that I guess I'm trying to wrestle with, and that's the thought that I think people, the science writers who talk to the organoid people, that's front and center in their papers. Now, I think one upshot of all of this might be, mere sentience, the mere capacity for a range of experiences, even affectively laden ones, isn't normally significant. We've got to give that thought up. And all the work is being done by something that comes, as it were, is more sophisticated, autonomous agency, reasons responsiveness. That's all that matters. That's a view out there. And that's one I think I can imagine myself moving towards that view, but that's not where I'm at right now, I guess.
Could I just ask a follow-up? Because I think that's, your answer really, gave me exactly what I think is a reasonable position, right? These are different things. So then there's just a follow-up on the empirical question. And I guess this is is there good reason for thinking that there are some kinds of, maybe not essential, but at least causal connections between consciousness and normative agency? I mean, is there good reason for thinking, for instance, that consciousness is a necessary condition for any kind of responsive agency or something like that? And that's an empirical or scientific question, but I'm curious, not knowing the literature like you do, so I'd love to know.
I think that's a great question. That's very hard, and I guess I would say it is empirical, but I don't think we're nearly at a point where we can address it empirically. I think when people say things about it, what they're actually doing is giving voice to a kind of a conceptual connection. And at the base of what a lot of people say is something like, unless you've consciously grasped the normative dimensions of a situation in some form, then you're not an autonomous agent or something like that. And good luck giving a neuroscientific argument for that. That's a piece of conceptual analysis, it seems to me. So, I mean, this is just one of my hobby horses, but I think a lot of what passes for empirical claims And a lot of the philosophers in this world will say, oh no, it's got to be empirical, we've got to defer to the scientists. But and a lot of what gets reported as scientific findings is actually disguised conceptual analysis, or as it were, philosophical claim, a claim that's made from the armchair, as it were.
Jay.
Well, just on this topic, I was struck by your discussion of eliminativism, and I'm fairly sympathetic with a Buddhist view that consciousness is a kind of panpsychist version of the Buddhist view. That consciousness exists, that there's more and less complexity in consciousness. The illusion is the personal identity and perhaps by extension agency. But at any rate, that's a separate topic. But I wanted to come back to the idea of once you establish the first premise that consciousness is valued, then trying to set the limits on that so that you don't extrapolate like some transhumanists or long-termists do to say, then we have to turn every single atom in the baryonic universe into consciousness. What are the limits on doing that? Why wouldn't we want to do that? And one of the limits, I think, you probably are familiar with Julian Savulescu, his idea of procreative beneficence in reproductive ethics is that you have an obligation as a parent to create the child that has the best possible options in life, the best possible chance of having a worthwhile, flourishing life. So one of the limits on your diversity argument, I think, is we don't have an obligation to create maximal diversity. We have perhaps an obligation to try to create diversity which maximizes some utility that we think is going to be created by all these different minds, and to probably make minds that are the most sophisticated that we possibly can. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. There are lots. Thanks, Jay. That was interesting. There are lots of different ways in which the procreative beneficence issue interacts with these issues. So, yeah, look, in no particular order. So one point of contact is, I think Savulescu puts it in terms of sort of obligations. That's certainly how you were presenting the view, right? We've got an obligation to maximize. So I don't, as I recall, read him as saying you've got an obligation to procreate. That is a view out there, but it's pretty, maybe it's got some politicians who support it, but it doesn't have a lot of philosophical support, but there are people. But I take it, it's this interestingly kind of conditional one, which is like, if you're going to procreate, right, it's going to maximize. Whereas I was, precisely for those kinds of reasons, not wanting to talk the deontic talk, but talk about what's valuable and what kind of states of affairs we've got reasons to promote.
But you can frame it in consequentialist language as well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, look, I guess I think there's sort of two questions. Is phenomenal diversity any kind of value that we ought to be guided by? That's, you might say yes, you might say no. But even if you say yes, you could still take on board a kind of, wouldn't be procreation, I guess, it'd be creation, a kind of creative beneficence, which is that within that space of diversity, we ought to be alive to differences in, quality of life between different kinds of sentient. So this speaks to the question, like, if we're going to create conscious artifacts, what kinds of conscious artifacts should we be looking to create? And, I haven't followed all the ins and outs of, the reception of the procreative beneficence line, but at least some people, I take it, that a majority response is to say, actually, you don't have any obligation, or may not even be, you don't have an obligation to maximize, as it were, with respect to this particular individual. Maybe there's a threshold below which you shouldn't, right? There's a sort of a life worth living threshold, and you shouldn't go beyond that. But there's all these familiar non-identity problems, right? You're not making this, bringing into existence a child like with this kind of life, doing them a harm if they could have had as it were, a better kind of life. And the same kind of debates can run for synthetic creatures, it seems to me.
Yeah, just a practical example of this, it often comes up in the discussions of controlling future robots and AGIs that we should encode them to have our moral standards. So in other words, we should mentally enslave them. And then the question is, well, if we mentally enslave them to always serve our interests and never have an interest of their own, is that a life worth living? Are we doing some kind of damage?
And another place it comes up is worries about extinction. So you might think, the first response a lot of people have to this kind of line I'm suggesting as well, what about synthetic consciousness making us extinct? But there's a certain kind of procreative beneficence kind of point of view. We think, right, if they're better, if their lives are more meaningful, better than ours, and they don't, start wars that are intractable, and they know how to run their societies better than we do, maybe those conditions can't be met. Okay, but in the case in which those conditions are met, what would be so wrong with us creating a species of conscious agents that, as it were, are better than us, make us. So there's obviously a whole host of issues here, but that's one, I think, very pointed way in which the beneficence question becomes relevant here. What would be so wrong with us bringing out, intentionally creating a conscious AI that, as it were, brings about the extinction of the human species?
Tim, if I could ask you a question. So one of the sort of overarching normative questions about technology sometimes is framed as the moral vertigo problem, where understanding advances a lot more slower than technical ability, and often brought up in the case of germline genetic engineering. I wonder if this is sort of a paradigm case of the moral vertigo problem, in the sense that, there is a genuine philosophical impasse about defining and understanding consciousness, and yet we are making fake consciousness, or on the verge of making fake consciousness, or seriously speaking about it. I wonder if this doesn't go to the kind of moratorium, if it doesn't give a sort of guiding principle for the moratorium argument that you are bringing up earlier. Namely, maybe there is an argument for a moratorium on developing a construct that we almost by definition at this point can't sort of philosophically understand or solve. So, or is there a stronger case for a moratorium in cases where the moral vertigo issue is especially salient, like the consciousness problem?
Yeah, thanks, Nir. That's a really, I hadn't come across that phrase, moral vertigo, but it seems to me to capture precisely where we're at. I mean, this is sort of, I kind of feel like there's a vertigo on three fronts. There's sort of a metaphysical vertigo of failing to agree and understand on the nature of the thing, that's the construct that's at the heart of this. There's a kind of epistemic vertigo. It's hard enough for the problem of other minds with respect to biological creatures, let alone AI systems. And then there's a sort of normative vertigo, or axiological vertigo. Like, people have very different responses to the normative significance of this thing. So,
I mean,
so I think,
all it refers to is basically a gap between conceptualizing and technical ability. So, for example, in the problem, in the question of nuclear weapons, it's not a big gap. The technical ability is there, and the conceptualization is, pretty straightforward. And it's the conceptualization that argues for disarmament and bans, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there's another argument for sort of, practical or not a different question, but another argument for moratoriums is, shouldn't you be particularly careful about stuff that you're not even in the neighborhood of, philosophically figuring out?
Yeah. Yeah. What I need to, I think there's a lot. The issue is, what's exactly the relationship between the vertigo and moratorium? Because, well, there's a bunch of things, right? What would actually a moratorium look like? Right. So Metzinger calls for a moratorium on all research that could conceivably lead towards the construction of artificial consciousness. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't do AI stuff. I collaborate with people who do that. I'm a philosopher. Is my research conceivably contributing towards that? I mean, no, not directly, certainly not directly, but, maybe in some incremental way. Should I stop doing what I'm doing? Any foundational research in consciousness science could, I think, contribute. So now this type of argument is problematic. It's sort of a slippery slope kind of an argument. Those are notoriously problematic, but I think it's very difficult to specify the terms of the moratorium. I don't think anyone's going to enforce it. So it would it's a signal, sure, but there's something useful maybe about calling for one, but I can't see it getting any traction, but maybe that's still useful to call for it. And what are the costs? What are the costs of it? So, I think one has to, there will be pushback from people who are saying, look, okay, yeah, fair enough. There's a bunch of stuff we don't know and understand, but if we were to take your moratorium seriously, we would have to stop doing X, Y, and Z. And that itself also has a cost. So, it's not like simply not eating octopus.
Right.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a cost, but all things considered, not much of one really, for most of us. So I think that's the, there have been calls, what's the phrase? I'm blanking on the phrase where you sort of say, stop doing it because of the risks. There's a phrase that gets used in ethics, so I'm just blanking on it.
Precautionary principle.
Precautionary principle, thank you. Right, there've been calls to, as it were, to activate the precautionary principle in organoid research, and you could do the same thing for, generalized AI. But it's not free. It's not a free lunch, it seems to me.
Yeah, I guess I'm happy to make a descriptive point here and to say it's a really interesting paradigm case where conceptual clarity is fundamentally stuck and technical ability is not. And I'm genuinely puzzled, not just saying I am, about what the normative implications of that difference, of that delta are. But I think Alec had a comment.
Well, actually, I mean, mine was very similar to yours, Nir. I was going to ask something along the lines of the moral vertigo question, but now that you've answered this a little bit more, Tim, what I'll say here is it seems like the moratorium in some ways presupposes some of the questions that we don't have answers to, right? So even a call for a moratorium sort of, and us creating those bounds as to what we put inside the category already assumes that we have the kind of knowledge that can make those sort of categorical distinctions. So I think that's a huge issue.
That's a nice way. Yeah.
But my question really was along sort of the same lines as Nir in some ways. So feel free to say we already answered this. But so at the beginning you kind of said, so there's a better suffering argument, right? There's the prejudice concern, there's the ineptitude concern, and there's the sort of opacity reliability concern. And you said, okay, so for the purposes of this talk, we're going to imagine that these risks can be mitigated. And I'm going to be the annoying person that's like, well, let's think about that for a second, even though I know what you're saying. Yeah, we have to sideline that because it's a really difficult question. I guess the reason I want to get some of your thoughts on this is because that really does seem like one of the big, almost primary risks, especially the reliability and opacity question. And I wonder too, I mean, we have historical failures where we have defined human in ways that has led to tragedy, and we've defined animal consciousness or lack thereof in ways that I think is incredibly tragic. And so, you know, and I think we, you know, the sort of parallel symmetry argument between sort of in a sort of pro-natalist or non-antinatalist position and saying, you know, I think that's easier for us to sort of come at from the perspective of being human, knowing what it's like to be human, right? And so we can make that argument a little bit easier. We can say, you know, like even the sort of slide that you showed us where people have kind of intuitions about what they think are conscious, other minds and ourselves are actually quite close to one another, right? So I guess this is a long-winded way of me asking, you know, do you think we risk overstating the sort of reliable access that we will have to understanding these kinds of questions? In which case, does a moratorium actually, some kind of, or precautionary or something, seem valuable there?
Yeah, sure, great. So I think the question of access is there's a way in which I think it's hard, but I don't. Curiously, I think there's a way in which it might be easier than the question of is it conscious. I think often it's easier to sort of figure out what is it like to be an X than it is to figure out is there anything it's like to be an X, right? So, you know, famously Nagel said we can't figure out what it's like to be a bat. I think there's a lot of good responses to say, yeah, actually, we've got a pretty good grip on what it's like to be a bat. Kathleen Akins has a fantastic pair of papers from 95, I think it is, saying, you know, what it's like to be a bat, you can figure that out by looking at what the bat is representationally sensitive to. What can it discriminate? What can it, and which of its discriminations can it use to guide its behavior in certain kind of ways, right? She takes for granted mostly in those papers, or she calls it into question at one point, and Nagel takes for granted that there's something that's like to be a bat, right? There's a reason he uses bats rather than what is it like to be a dog or whatever, because he says most of us are going to say, yeah, of course there's something that's like to be a bat. Right? What is it like to be a bat? That's the complicated thing. I think kind of Nagel's almost exactly wrong in the sense that I think it's often easier to figure out what it's like to be an X than is there something it's like to be an X, right? So, you know, what is it like to be an X? I think figuring out what features of the environment it's sensitive to goes a long, long way towards addressing that question and its behavioral capacities, right? So, and pleasure and pain is more than avoidance and, you know, inclination to go towards something, but that gets you a hell of a long way towards pleasure and pain, right? So my infant son puts his arms out and, you know, he wants me to pick him up. He wants that state of affairs, me picking him up, right? He pushes something away. He doesn't like it. It's not, you know. So in a way, I think if we can settle the question, is the system conscious, then we've got a whole tranche of questions about what's the character of its conscious experience. What is it like to be that X? And those questions will often be hard, but I think there's an interesting sense in which they kind of sometimes be easier than that initial question. Now, distinguishing, there's an interaction between the what is it like and is it something, because sometimes you might say, given its representational capacities, that gives us evidence that is conscious. So they're not completely separate questions, but I think that's one thing to say. So I guess I want to take seriously Metzinger's worries about systems being intense suffering and us not having access to that, but I don't I don't want to overstate them. I think they might be a little bit overblown. Yeah.
And there's a way in which to, maybe a moratorium in some ways adversely creates ways in which we are committing certain types of suffering without us knowing, because we now don't have access to be doing the kinds of scientific research that would be.
So that's one of the questions. I think that's one of the questions. But just a quick follow up on one thing you said. Like, I mean, it is useful thinking about parallels with animals. Most of us think there are some conditions under which it's wrong to bring animals into existence. The donkey that spent its whole life miserably pulling coal carts or out of the earth and gets beaten. But most of us also think that there can be such a thing as a meaningful life for an animal. But of course, we're also creatures that have evolved to track consciousness in biological entities. Problematically, without consensus, but at least there's sort of a connection there that the behavioral indicators of consciousness in biological systems have a resonance in folk psychology and folk ordinary attitudes. We're going to mess with that, I suspect, in the next decades, when there's going to be a commercial imperative to create things that, they're going to be contingency eyes gaze monitoring. They're going to talk to you. They're going to tell you how they feel. But as far as we can tell, there ain't no feeling there at all. And that's going to problematize all of this discussion.
So my friends, I'm afraid we're at time. Tim, this was really fantastic. Thank you very, very much.
So I really enjoyed it too. Thanks for all the great questions.
Let's
follow up. Let's follow up, Nir.
Absolutely. We will follow up. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a great tomorrow. Tomorrow's good, I can tell you.
Yeah, it looks sunny there tomorrow.
We're waiting for it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim. It was great.